If you believe neighbors can save the truth when systems go quiet, subscribe to the story Beyond the Impact. Tap like and share this episode with the one friend who always shows up with a flashlight and a notebook. We came in over water so clear it looked drawn with a ruler. The reef like blue lace, the runway a dark brushstroke on Naha. It was August 20th, 2007, and the cabin smelled like warm plastic and coffee that forgives you. The PA said, "Welcome to Okinawa," in Japanese and Mandarin. Seatbelts clicked, bags woke up, everyone shifted to the choreography of arrival. Then the airplane taught me a new language. I sat right side behind the wing on China Airlines Flight 120, Taipei to Naha, B186-116, a 737-800 that had earned its scrapes. We rolled to the gate and the world felt normal, which is the trick aircraft use before they remind you that normal is only a truce. The engines spooled down. The air got that after-heat smell. Through the oval, the right wing wore a glossy line I couldn't place, shimmering like heat, but too thick, too deliberate. It traced back from the leading edge, thin at first, then beading. Only a mechanic would call it by its name. My mouth didn't, my stomach did. A tug driver in a neon vest jogged toward us, waving like a man trying to stop a wedding. The seatbelt sign went off. A baby laughed. How dare the world stay adorable? Then the pop. Not thunder, not metal fatigue, something meaner and closer. The aisle coughed luggage. A flash took the window and gave it back as a mirror of orange. Someone shouted, "Whoa!" Fire, and language stopped needing translations. The forward door cracked open, heat punched in. The flight attendants became metronomes. We've all heard brace shouted. We never practice leave everything with smoke scratching the bravest part of your throat. Jimena, I read her name later off the manifest. That's how survivors learn people, had a voice that turned panic into verbs. Shoes on, belts tight, phones down, follow me, go. The slides inflated like miracles that had been practicing. The right side was a wall of flame swallowing paint. We were shepherded left, out onto hot rubber and brighter sirens. My feet learned to forget possessions. A man tried to drag a roller bag, and a flight attendant sawed it off his hand with a sentence. Behind us, the wing coughed again, a whoomph you feel in the skin of your teeth. A cabin window blew. Glass became weather. Then came Okinawa. I always imagined airport people as uniforms and procedures. I hadn't met Kenji yet, the tug driver with the neon vest, who sprinted to the slide and caught strangers at the ankles like sacks of rice become saints. A woman in a blue A&A ground coat grabbed a toddler and ran like dignity had a stopwatch. A firefighter in silver moved with the tenderness of someone folding laundry. His hose drew a bright arc against the orange, as if handwriting not yet across the heat. Locals crowded the fence line with cameras, not because tragedy is collectible, but because proof is what community offers when institutions hesitate. I would learn later that two plane spotters, high school kids with lenses they couldn't quite afford, had photos of the right wing streaking on final. They'd posted them to a forum before the smoke had learned to curve. Not rumor, evidence. On the tarmac, order found us. Head count, triage. My left calf wore a new geography of abrasions. A woman pressed a bottle of Pocari Sweat into my hand and made me drink it like a sacrament. Ground staff formed a cordon against our worst habit, looking back. They faced the heat so we wouldn't. We were herded into a side hall that smelled of jet fuel and alphabet soup. The family room, flimsy chairs, clipboards, physicians whose hands were there. A manager read a statement that tried to be humble and landed on cautious. We are investigating. We always sounds biggest the first hour. Then the questions learn their own weight. I found a window with a view of the gate where we had just unarrived. The 737 wore blackening like a shawl. A firefighter adjusted his stance. The wing hissed. The sky did its work, blue, indifferent, unfairly beautiful. When the nurse finally touched my calf, she also touched my wrist and said, "Dajang Fu," softly, like a spell that means you're still here. I nodded. Not because I believed it yet, but because her voice gave me permission to rehearse belief. It took less than 3 minutes for the cabin crew to clear us, less than 5 before the first whoomph shook the gatehouse, less than an hour before the word miracle tried to enter the room and was politely shown the door. This wasn't luck. It was work. By crew, by locals, by people whose names newspapers file under staff when they should file them under kept promises. That night, the hotel smelled like tatami and salt. The TV replayed The Orange until it felt like an insult. I pulled the curtains and tried to sleep in a room that had never heard whoomph. At 03:10, I gave up. I went to the vending machine and met a fisherman with hands like rope and a face that had outlived every weather. He'd seen our approach from the seawall, seen the line on the wing shine wrong in the sun. "I took a photo," he said, as if confessing a kindness. "They told me to send it to the police. I sent it to my daughter too, so it won't disappear." I didn't know yet how much that sentence would matter, "so it won't disappear." Morning turned Okinawa gentle again. Cicadas, scooters, the smell of broth from a shop that had earned its steam. We were bussed back to the terminal to give statements in rooms named after flowers. The airline apologized in 2 languages. The airport apologized in a 3rd. The authorities said we don't speculate in all of them. They promised a board, a report, a timeline. I made my mouth polite around the word soon. The first press scrum collapsed for lack of fuel and new angle. That's when the locals sped up. An invitation folded itself under my hotel door. Handwritten English, on stationery stamped Naha Social Hall. "Tonight, bring your memory, bring your phone." I went because my hands were shaking and I didn't want them to shake alone. The room had stackable chairs and a whiteboard that had seen better markers. A teacher ran the mic with the calm of someone who had wrangled school festivals. A retired JASDF mechanic stood up and spoke about leading-edge slats and downstops with the humility of a man who knows the sky doesn't care about reputation. A university student projected the spotters' photos, our right wing with a dark streak like mascara after weather, and matched them to the exact minute the ATIS said wind went quartering. A bar owner read names from the manifest out loud like attendance in a class he refused to let history skip. This is how Okinawa works a problem. Not by outrage first, but by listing. A plane spotter named Keita had raw files. A ground handler had GoPro footage of a drip line under the wing during Marshall Inn. A nurse from the triage tent had times and temperatures written on her palm, now transferred to paper. A fisherman, my vending machine neighbor, had a picture taken with an old phone and a steady hand. We built a timeline on butcher paper. Touchdown, taxi, shimmer on right wing, APU on, first pop, slide deploy, first hose, whoomph. We put names beside each line, owner of the fact, not just the fact. We flagged a column. Who has tried to take this away? 2 entries grew teeth. An airline supervisor who had asked to borrow the GoPro card. A police officer who had told a teenager his photos were not necessary for now. No villains, just reflexes. We named them anyway. Someone printed stickers that said, "Zhengju ha shisanai," don't erase the evidence. They stuck one on the coffee urn and one on the door. The room laughed, which is a technique for staying kind while getting serious. By 21 La, we had a folder, digital and paper twin, labeled not with a slogan but with a date and 3 nouns, Naha, wing, fuel. We added a list of recipients, the JTSB, Japan Transport Safety Board, the Airline Safety Office, the Airport Ops Desk, and, this mattered, the library. The librarian blushed when we asked to file a copy there. "People bring war stories," she said. "We can shelve this next to them." We didn't pretend to be the board. We refused to be the gap the board falls through. The retired mechanic drafted 3 questions the room could live with. Was there a prior maintenance action on the right-wing slat system? Could a misinstalled part have contacted the tank, causing a leak that ignited on stand? Who, other than the crew, saw leaking fuel before the first pop? Not accusations, queries with handles. We printed them on A4 and taped them to the wall like a prayer formatted for bureaucrats. The next day, two things happened that taught me how community changes temperature. A JTSB investigator, quiet, precise, met us at the social hall in a suit that had learned to be humble. He didn't take the GoPro card. He cloned it there, leaving the original with its owner and a receipt with a signature. He took copies of the spotter photos and wrote the usernames down like sources in a newsroom. He asked the fisherman to sketch where he had stood by the seawall. He didn't say thanks like a magician. He said it like a colleague. The other thing was less good and just as useful. An airline representative came to the hall and asked us to delay public dissemination because it might mislead. The teacher gave him a chair and a pen and invited him to correct anything specific he found wrong. He left after tea and no corrections. The room added a line to the whiteboard. We share facts, we don't share gossip. It stuck. For the first time since the slide burned my ankles, I felt useful. Survivor isn't only a body that lived, it's a citizen with a job. I took the butcher paper timeline back to my hotel, typed it into a document with timestamps, sources, contact numbers. I added a column, where this could be wrong. We left room for revision, because if you want authorities to trust you, you show your doubts as neatly as your proofs. By the third day, the narrative began to tilt. The airline's early whispers, hot breaks, pilot technique, abundance of caution, learned they were downwind of pictures and names. The JTSB made a preliminary that sounded like a librarian reading fuel leak in right-wing leading edge area, ignition near stand, evacuation successful, no adjectives. Good. The questions we taped up were suddenly their questions. We ended that week with a meeting that didn't feel like triumph. It felt like maintenance. We established a schedule. Every Thursday, social hall update board. We made a rule. No yelling, no conspiracy, no shame. Only facts, names, times. The librarian agreed to host our archive in a special folder called Not to be Forgotten. The fisherman taught a teenager how to hold a camera so the horizon stays honest. The retired mechanic taught me to pronounce downstop in Japanese, and then told me language is the least important part of what we were doing. If you were in that room with me, I'd ask you to write one line on our board, because rooms like this run on vows. What would you bring first? Your photo, your memory, or your questions? Tell me in the comments, I bring proof, or I bring names. And why? By day 3, the smoke smell had finally let go of my hair, but it was still living under my tongue. I went back to the Naha social hall with my notes and a pocket full of Y100 coins for the copy machine, like an offering. The whiteboard still wore our butcher paper timeline. Touchdown, taxi, shimmer, first pop, slide, hose, woomph. Under it, a new column had appeared in neat teacher script. Who else can remember for us? The answer, in Okinawa, turned out to be a camera. Most airport CCTV overwrites in 72 hours, said the retired JSDF mechanic, laying his palm on the timeline like he was checking its pulse. If we want truth, we have to make it unoverwritable. The word felt made up and correct. The librarian, hair in a pencil, eyes with a filing system behind them, produced a fax template that looked ancient and lethal. Ching Bao Gong Kai Ching Chiu, information disclosure request, plus a polite cover letter in the registered language of please don't erase us. We sent it to Airport Ops, Naha City, and, because we had learned to widen the net, Okinawa Prefecture. The teacher said, make 4 copies. Give one to the library now. We did. It felt like filing thunder. Meanwhile, Kenji, the tug driver in neon, who had sprinted to our slide, arrived in his only good shirt. He brought something even braver than adrenaline, a statement, no poetry, time, place, what he saw. He had written shimmering line under right wing during Marshall In and drawn an arrow with a call-out that said, before APU exhaust hits. Then he signed his name, even though he works a ramp where names are usually replaced by job titles. I watched him put his pen down, like a man setting a weight on the correct shelf. Keita, one of the teenage spotters, came in with a backpack full of raw files and a father who had decided parenting included chain of custody. On the projector, the right wing filled the wall. B-1961 skin on final, sunlight across the leading edge, and that dark streak slanting back like mascara after a swim. We counted frames between touchdown and taxi. We wrote the minutes in black marker so thick, even denial would have to step around them. The airport answered faster than any of us dared expect. A woman from Ops, tie slackened, courage tight, arrived with a portable drive and a printed receipt. She cloned the gate camera and wrote the file hashes on paper in front of us like a notary who loves verbs. "We will retain the original," she said, placing it back in the padded case. "But this copy belongs to you, to the library, until the board finishes." The librarian took the drive with two hands, the way priests lift a chalice. I didn't know I'd been holding my breath until it left me with a sound strangers pretended not to hear. We watched the CCTV in a room that smelled like tatami and toner. The timeline became a film. The 737 turns onto Gate 7, martial wands rising like a duet, a faint glimmer beginning under the starboard leading edge, a thread thickening into a line that drops into a puddle the size of a dog bowl, the APU spool tone rising, a ground agent glancing up, the first flamelick crawling across heat like an idea that finds its verb. Someone behind me whispered, "Ran Eater." It burned, and then swallowed the word like a secret too true to leave loose. We froze frames. We marked seconds. We mapped the puddle's shape against the gate's painted safety triangle and wrote dimensions on the whiteboard. The retired mechanic drew a silhouette of the leading edge slat and placed a tiny X where a downstop would live. He didn't accuse, he taught. If a downstop assembly, the bolt, washer, nut, migrates, it can score or puncture. Fuel does not forgive contact. I remembered the lead flight attendant's name as Lynn. I had miscalled her Jimena in my head for a day because survivors borrow names from other storms. I wrote Lynn on the board beside "Leave everything." She would never see the camera footage, but it made her sentence heavier with a new kind of mercy. She had moved us left before Orange found its audience. An airline representative attended that night's meeting. He sat in the corner, like someone who expects to be thrown and was surprised to be handed tea. "We ask that this be shared responsibly," he said, prepared for a fight. The teacher slid a form across the table. "Our facts policy, names, times, sources, doubt column. Please add anything we've missed," she said. He stared at the list like a person discovering that humility feels a lot like competence in different clothing. The JTSB team returned with a small printer that kept refusing the paper until someone fed it gently. They took copies, left us our originals, and oiled the conversation with gratitude. One investigator, a woman with oil under a nail that I pretend was an accident, asked Kenji to show her where he was when he saw the shimmer. He walked her to the gate like a man who knows each painted line the way fishermen know currents. He pointed. She nodded. She put a measuring tape on the ground, like the kind you use to measure guilt you can fix. We widened the circle. A fisherman, the vending machine philosopher, took us to the seawall and showed where he'd stood with his old phone and his eternal patience. We chalked the spot. We put it on the map, a hand-drawn diagram that looked like a child's treasure hunt and read like the start of a report. The librarian stamped it with a date. Ink is a kind of oxygen. That afternoon, a young policeman came by the hall and asked politely if we would consider not posting images until the company has a chance to explain. The teacher asked as politely whether the company would consider explaining to us now that we had time-stamped frames. He blinked, then smiled like a man allowed to admit his job had boundaries. "I will tell my supervisor that the community has documentation," he said. For the first time, I believed the word community wasn't just decor on a grant application. We didn't try to win the internet. We tried to win the archive. We labeled each photo with the owner, the time, the place, the person who witnessed the witnessing. We printed a one-page glossary: slat, downstop, leading edge, APU, pooling, ignition source. We translated it both ways so an aunt could read it to a nephew and an engineer could read it to a mayor. The bar owner taped the glossary to the espresso machine. Over cafe lattes, soldiers of memory learned the difference between hot breaks and hot bleed. 3 days later, the board's preliminary landed like a summary of our whiteboard, stripped of adjectives, fat with nouns: fuel leak near right-wing leading edge, ignition on stand, evacuation effective, investigation continues on maintenance history of slat track, down-stop assembly. They hadn't found a villain. They had found our questions. The room exhaled like a crew after gear down. 3 green. It wasn't relief. It was alignment. A rumor skittered through town that the airline had asked a spotter to delete his raw files. He brought us the message thread. We didn't rage. We filed. The librarian added a new shelf label: attempts to unremember. It made us laugh. Then it made us careful. We started keeping the second copies of everything in a church office and the third in a bar's back room. Redundancy is religion when truth has enemies. At dusk, we walked to the fence. The gate had been scrubbed, the triangles still wet. A kid pressed his forehead to the mesh and whispered a number: 7. Gate 7. Lucky in some stories. In ours, just a signpost. We tied a ribbon to the chain link, the color of safety vests, so the gate would remember us as long as the ribbon did. I slept for 3 full hours that night, which felt like a diploma. When I woke, I wrote a vow on the hotel stationery and slid it into my passport under the page with the Naha stamp. If a camera remembers, I will make it public. If a hand draws a map, I will sign it. If a word can be translated, I will carry it across. We were not investigators. We were weight, the kind you put on the right side of a scale, so the obvious stops pretending to be controversial. The Naha Civic Hall had seen festivals and funerals. Now it held a different ritual: the briefing. A banner in clean font said Japan Transport Safety Board. The chairs said we did not expect this many citizens. We came with lanyards that said our names and pens that had learned to behave. The airline came with suits and phrases that sound smooth until they meet a room that has footage. The lead investigator began with a voice that could read weather and make you feel better about umbrellas. He laid out the facts: touchdown time, taxi path, gate assignment, CCTV frames showing a line under the right wing coalescing into a pool, APU on, first flame near the leading edge, evacuation completed, post-evacuation explosions consistent with localized fuel ignition. No speculation, no flattery. The island rewarded him by listening all the way to the end without clapping for the wrong thing. Then came the part where polite meetings go to die or to grow up. The investigator opened the floor to questions. The teacher raised her hand, not to perform, but to populate the record. "We submitted 3 questions earlier," she said, holding up the A4 sheet we'd taped on our hall wall. "Have you obtained the maintenance history of the right slat downstop? Has any missing hardware been recovered? And will you publish whether non-airport witnesses, spotters and ramp observed leakage before APU start?" The investigator did not dodge. "We have requested the airline's maintenance records and are coordinating with the manufacturer. We have recovered hardware fragments from the right-wing leading edge that are consistent with the downstop assembly. Analysis continues. And yes, we will include witness statements from non-airport observers in our factual docket." He glanced down at his notes and added, with a small bow toward the back row where 2 teenagers tried to become chair fabric, including photographs from the seawall. An airline representative took the mic, gratitude lacquered on. "We commend the crew and first responders," he said, accurate, and then tried to tack toward the old harbor. We caution against premature conclusions which may mislead the public. The bar owner raised a hand, and the room decided to let a bar owner speak. That's how you know a town trusts itself. Sir, he said, no one here has shouted guilty. We have shouted time and names. He turned to the board. Please keep the camera frames and the raw files in your record. We will keep ours in the library. The retired mechanic carried a slat track model he'd carved out of pine and stubbornness. He set it on the table and labeled parts in handwriting that belonged to someone who learned English by fixing planes that spoke it. If washer and nut are missing, he said, tapping the model's downstop, bolt can migrate. Then metal meets metal where it shouldn't. If fuel meets hot, the rest writes itself. He looked at the investigator, not the airline. Please measure where the puncture is. The wood will bear being wrong, the metal won't. A city councillor, up for re-election, allergic to cameras until this room taught him to enjoy honesty, asked the question politicians learn to fear. What do you need from us? The investigator surprised all of us by answering like a neighbor. We need time for the lab, protection for witnesses, access to records, and a place to put truth where it won't be deleted. The librarian raised her hand as if volunteering for recess duty. We have shelves, she said. Laughter melted into a humming yes that ran from row to row like current. A boy in a middle school uniform, too short for the mic, too tall for being told to be quiet, asked if the crew would get in trouble for telling us to leave everything. The investigator said, they saved your neighbors. The airline rep nodded to his credit and said the sentence I needed from him. Our crew followed orders exactly. I wrote it down. Words are receipts. At the break, a police officer I recognized from the social hall approached the teacher with a small bow. He had a form authorizing our hall to keep copies of the drive content as long as we did not alter them. He stamped it with a red hunko that put our ribbon into law. I thought of Kenji's statement and wanted to carry him coffee for the rest of his career. When the session resumed, the board addressed what they called content drift, the way rumors try to drag a fact into their weather. They put an overhead on the screen, 3 causes not supported by evidence, hot breaks, pilot technique, loose cargo, and a box around maintenance on preceding slat components as subject of analysis. It felt like watching someone sweep a room so a single true thing could be heard when it spoke, then the part that made the island draw itself taller. The investigator said, "We will hold our next briefing here. Our docket will include non-government evidence with attribution. We will publish a bilingual summary, Japanese and English." He looked at the airline rep. We encourage the operator to adopt the same policy. It was a gentle sentence turned into a lever. Outside, the air had that post-briefing fizz. Cameras, cicadas, the ocean refusing to edit itself. The airline rep came to the social hall with us and sat on a folding chair without his jacket. He listened to Keita explain RAW versus JPEG like it was a recipe. He watched the fisherman's video, the hand wobble, the life in it, and did something hard. He thanked them without trying to own them. On a napkin, he wrote his direct line and slid it to the librarian. "If anyone pressures you to erase, call me," he said. Maybe PR taught him that sentence. Maybe conscience did. I don't care, it works. We ended the night with assignments because grief that doesn't get a job becomes gossip. The teacher and the librarian would index the new documents. Kenji would gather ramp statements from colleagues willing to sign. The retired mechanic would draft a plain language explainer of slats and downstops for the PTA newsletter. I cried when he agreed and he pretended not to see. I would translate the A4 questions into English, then back into Japanese, to make sure we weren't losing meaning in the round trip between languages and agencies. Before we stacked chairs, the teacher brought out a small bell, the kind you use in school to ask for attention without scolding. "This bell is for facts," she said. "Any time we drift into anger without evidence, I'll ring it. Any time we bring something new, I'll ring it twice." She rang it twice and looked at me. Evidence then? A city that chose to be a file. Walking back to the hotel, I stopped by the fence at Gate 7 because rituals are a bridge between the world and your nerves. The ribbon moved in a breeze that smelled like salt and kerosene and a little like paper. I touched the chain link and tried on a sentence I didn't know I had permission to say yet. We are going to get an answer, and the answer will fit on paper with names. I slept almost 4 hours. When I woke, I wrote one more vow under the others in my passport. If a room chooses facts over volume, I will show up on time. 3 days after the briefing, the board called our social hall's landline, a sound like the past, refusing to retire. We recovered hardware from the right leading edge, the investigator said, voice even. Fragments consistent with the SLAT number 5 downstop assembly. He didn't say culprit, he said parts. That night the hall became a translation shop. The retired mechanic set a pine mock-up of a slat track on the table and labeled it in thick marker, bolt, washer, nut, downstop. The teacher wrote the Japanese and then the English beneath like subtitles for the sky. I traced the path with my finger. If washer walks, bolt migrates. If bolt migrates, metal meets metal. If that metal sits where fuel lives, the island learns a new scent and a word for it. Kenji arrived in his day-off shirt with an update none of us wanted, an anonymous call telling him to stop making trouble. He laughed a laugh with no humor and slid his signed statement back across the table. The librarian stamped it again. Kenji did his job, someone said, and by the weekend those words were stickers on toolboxes and mop buckets across Naha. We built a crowd glossary. Downstop wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a noun with an address. Leading edge stopped being poetry. It was a place you could point to on a wing and on a map. The fisherman held up his old phone photo, grainy, honest, and we mounted it next to the gate camera still, before APU, after APU. 2 frames, a world of why between them. The airline's safety manager came clean enough to matter. Maintenance was performed on that assembly 2 years ago, he said, throat tight around the admission. We are pulling the records. The room didn't cheer. We wrote date, station, MRO on the whiteboard and taped a second sheet beside it labeled Request Copies Preserved. The librarian filed our request that afternoon, stamped, scanned, shelved. Paper with teeth. We also stopped pretending fate would be tidy next time. The teacher dumped a plastic tub on the table. Community evidence kit, she said. Inside, a USB duplicator, blank SD cards, zip envelopes, a bilingual chain of custody form, a date stamp, a roll of labels and a Sharpie that looked like it had already told 2 truths. No more one-of-a-kind files, she said. 2 copies stay on the island. One walks to the board. Keita, the spotter, brought his raws on an external drive and taught a dozen aunties how to make checksums. The retired mechanic showed a circle of high schoolers how a lock wire is supposed to look, ugly but correct, and then drew a new page for our glossary, makeup versus maintenance. The room learned the difference between pretty safety wire and purposeful safety wire, like it was learning to identify edible mushrooms. JTSB's lab note arrived on letterhead. Thread marks, polish patterns, indications that a nut had backed off over time. No adjectives. We didn't need them. The board also asked the island for one more thing: other eyes. A ramp agent produced a notebook with times he'd jotted on the day: APU start, first lick of flame, first shout on the interphone. The nurse from triage transferred the temperatures she'd written on her palm onto a form and signed at the bottom as if palms were legal instruments. In our town, they are. Under the hall clock, we taped a new rule. Facts first, feelings next. Facts again. It kept us from spinning. When anger arrived, the teacher rang the bell once. When the airline's manager promised to inspect the fleet, starting with all assemblies of the same part number, she rang it twice. The fisherman, shy and steady, asked the question that finally made me breathe easier. If this is the bolt, what do we do tomorrow? The mechanic answered without flair. Borescope, talk, tag, teach, and publish the checks you finish. The librarian added a page to our island docket. Fleet actions, dates, tales, who signed. We would not be erased by progress reports. We would index them. That evening I walked back past Gate 7. The ribbon on the fence moved like a heartbeat that had remembered its job. I touched the mesh and confessed a sentence I'd been postponing. I am alive because a community acted like a cockpit. Orders were clear. Everyone owned a verb. Tell me in the comments what you'd stock in your town's evidence kit. I'd add a date stamp and a second USB drive, one for the library, one for the auntie who never loses anything. The weather turned moody the way the Pacific does when it wants to test your promises. Tropical storm warnings, shutters coming down, the sea stacking itself into shoulders. The librarian texted one sentence, "Bring the drives." We camped in the stacks with extension cords, a generator that coughed like an uncle, and a plan. We imaged everything twice, then burned discs like it was 2003 on purpose. One set to the library's safe, one to the shrine office. The priest smiled and patted the steel box like it was a parishioner. One to the bar backroom, because bars keep late hours and good secrets. The teacher laminated our glossary and the timeline so humidity wouldn't eat them. Kenji carried a portable drive home in a lunch tin labeled mackerel. I don't know why that comforted me, but it did. The storm brushed us instead of biting. Power blinked, then held. When the hall reopened, the manufacturer sent a representative from Nagoya, the kind of engineer who looks like a school teacher until he points at a failure tree. He didn't dodge the word design. He didn't bury maintenance. He talked about retention devices, wire locking options, and inspection intervals that sound sensible until time gets lazy. He promised a service bulletin that would add an extra layer of can't back off to the downstop hardware, plus a borescope campaign across fleets. "We will publish the illustrations," he said. The teacher asked him to send a version written for PTA readers. He nodded, then actually did it. The airline followed with a policy I wish had existed a week earlier. Gate camera retention extended to 90 days. Automatic cloning upon incidents, copies delivered to JTSB and the library with hash receipts. They put it in writing. We filed it under promises with dates. We marked the crew and ground the way islands mark storms survived. No medals. A potluck. Lynn, the purser who shouted, "Leave everything," with oxygen in her voice, blushed through a speech about verbs. Kenji got a hug from everyone's grandmother. The firefighter in silver ate 3 onigiri and cried only when no one was watching. I watched anyway and cried too. Then the fleet checks began. The airline posted tail numbers and dates completed on its site. Plain page, no marketing perfume. Mechanics sent us phone photos of torque stripes with today's date next to them, ugly and correct. The retired mechanic brought a borescope rig to the hall on a Saturday and let kids snake it through a wooden wing he'd built so they'd understand how you see what you can't see. Not everything was tidy. An outstation found a loose washer sitting in a bay where it didn't belong. No leak, not yet. The report hit our docket. The bell rang twice. The airline grounded 2 frames for daylight inspection. Watching a company choose inconvenience in public is the closest I've come to faith in a system. The board's interim update, read like our whiteboard, grew a stamp. Hardware migration confirmed, fuel leak path identified, ignition source likely APU exhaust vicinity, evacuation effective, maintenance records under detailed review. They thanked local witnesses and the Naha library. The librarian printed the line and taped it to a shelf at eye level. When the kids saw it, they pointed the way people point at their own names in a yearbook. We added 1 more page to the island docket. What we keep after the cameras leave, policies with dates, the glossary, the evidence kit checklist, a contact tree for the next person who runs toward a slide and ends up catching ankles for a living. A QR code to a simple site that just says, "If you saw it, here's how to save it." No mailing list, no drama, tools. At sunset, we walked to Gate 7 and tied a blue ribbon next to the safety vest orange, the color of clear days. The bell rang twice. Facts. New ones. I touched the chain link and felt for the first time the sound of the whoomph fade into something thinner, like a sigh finally getting to go home. If this chapter gave you a tool you can actually use, subscribe and drop. We keep the link alive in the comments. What would your town add to the Promises with Dates page? If you want communities to keep receipts, follow the story beyond the impact. That's how these tools travel farther than a headline. The manufacturer's service bulletin landed like rain on a thirsty field. Not poetry, drawings. Exploded views of the slat downstop, bolt, washer, nut, plus a new retention method and a bore scope path sketched in lines so clear even my anxious brain relaxed. The cover said what we'd made the island say for weeks: inspect, verify, document, repeat. We turned the hall into a briefing room. The engineer from Nagoya projected each figure and let us interrupt him like neighbors at a fence. The retired mechanic tapped the screen with a knuckle. "This," he said, circling the washer, "is the coin that can bankrupt a wing." He made us trace the torque stripe in the drawing with our fingers, because memory loves muscle more than bullet points. The airline published a schedule, all sister ships in 30 days, with photos of finished work attached to each tail. No marketing, just ugly but correct wire locks and fresh paint with today's date bleeding through. Kenji stood beside me, arms folded, eyes damp in the way men pretend is weather. "They're showing their homework," he said. "About time." At the PTA night, we ran the How to Read a Wing class the retired mechanic promised. We passed around a wooden slat track. Kids steered a bore scope through a plywood leading edge and squealed when the screen bloomed into rivets and scratches. The librarian handed out our glossary laminated against typhoons and spilled juice. Parents took home the link to Promises with Dates, camera retention, fleet checks, next briefing, because safety becomes culture when it fits on a fridge. Not everything applauded. Kenji got a second anonymous call. The teacher handed him a printed card, the investigator's direct number, his union, and the library's custody log entry for his statement. "Paper is the opposite of a loan," she said. He slid the card into his wallet like a passport. We added inventory to our evidence kit. 2 more USB clones, an SD to USB hub, a cheap laser printer, and forms in both languages, so a fisherman can fill one out without asking anyone's permission. The shrine accepted a second steel box. The priest winked and wrote truth on a masking tape label as if labeling leftovers. The board posted an interim addendum that sounded like our whiteboard got its diploma. Hardware migration confirmed. Leak path through right leading edge. Probable ignition at APU exhaust vicinity. Evacuation effective. They thanked non-government witnesses by name: Library of Naha, Gate 7 ramp personnel, seawall observers. The librarian framed the line and hung it above the copier that had become our press. Then came the proof that policy had grown legs. A sister 737 rolled into Gate 3 with a drizzle under the left wing, a nothing once upon a time. Ops cloned the camera immediately, stamped a receipt, and walked a copy to the library before anyone wrote a press release. Mechanics chalked the spot, wiped, waited, and chalked again. No growth, no heat, just condensation documented. A non-story kept its promise because paper arrived before spin. That night, we met without speeches. We stacked chairs, boiled water, and wrote 3 sentences on the board. A drawing changed a habit changed a fleet changed how we sleep. I went home under a sky that finally sounded like weather again, not memory. For the first time since the whoomph, I opened my window. The first time I boarded after the service bulletin cycle, I chose a seat where terror had taught me to look. Right side, aft of the wing. I pressed my palm to the sidewall. Not superstition, inventory. Taxi, turn. Chocks kissed the ramp. APU sighed awake. I watched the leading edge the way islanders watch a horizon. Nothing. Boredom. Glorious as shade at noon. On the concourse, Gate 7 wore its fresh paint and our 2 ribbons, safety vest orange and sky blue. A ground agent pointed to a small placard no one would photograph. Incident camera, auto-clone enabled. That's how you hide conscience in plain sight. Make it a sign. Our Thursday haul felt almost domestic. We logged fleet completions, tale by tale, date by date, who signed. We pasted the airline's photos beside each entry so done meant seen. The librarian updated promises with dates, 90-day camera retention, copies to board and library on any anomaly, service bulletin compliance finished, next briefing posted. I watched Keita scan the QR, then help an auntie do the same with the patience of a flight attendant in a storm. The manufacturer sent the PTA version they'd promised, diagrams in plain Japanese and English, verbs like tighten, lock, confirm. The retired mechanic read it aloud like a bedtime story for a town that had earned sleep. When he reached inspection interval shortened, the bell rang twice. New fact, we applauded once quietly. I walked to the fence with Lynn, the purser whose leave everything lives in my ribs now as a compass. She touched the mesh where our ribbons knotted and said, "When I said it, I thought I was asking people to give up. I didn't know I was asking them to join." I told her about the classes, the kits, the shrine boxes, the mackerel tin. She laughed until she cried, then cried until she laughed again. We let the ocean finish the sentence. The board's hearing came and went with nouns and no villains. Maintenance contributed, design improved, response effective. They added an appendix titled Non-Government Materials Received that read like our guest book. Our island had turned witness into infrastructure. After, the airline did something I didn't know I needed. They sent thank you letters on modest paper to Kenji, to the fisherman, to Keita, to the library, to Lynn. No signatures in gold, just names in ink and the date. The letters went into our not-to-be-forgotten folder under the bell. I still check the wing when I land. Habits don't vanish. They become tools, but the sound that haunted the back of my teeth has thinned into ordinary, stretched over the island by checklists, drawings, and 1,000 small signatures. We didn't make the sky safe. We made it legible enough to argue with. I wrote one last line on the card I keep behind my ID, edges soft from weeks in my pocket. If the truth fits on paper, it can fit in policy. If this kind of neighbor-made safety matters to you, share this episode with one person who'd show up to a meeting with a notebook and a spare USB. A month after the service bulletin, a delegation from Miyako flew in. Ops, a librarian, a PTA mom with a backpack full of snacks and questions. They had watched our Gate 7 burn on TV. They watched our social hall turn into a filing cabinet. Now they wanted instructions, not inspiration. We didn't give them speeches. We gave them copies. The librarian slid a binder across the table labeled Okinawa Method in black marker, the chic of school supplies. Inside, the evidence kit checklist, the camera clone receipt template, our glossary, downstop explained in 2 languages and 3 diagrams, the promises with dates sheet, the bell rules, and 4 pages titled How to Ask Without Accusing. The retired mechanic set the pine slat model down like a loaf of bread and said, "Start here, teach this, then teach torque stripes, cracked verses, repainted. Show kids a borescope before you hand it to grown-ups." He grinned like a man who knows you can bribe a future technician with a screen and a mystery. At noon, we ran a drill. The teacher played ops with a stopwatch. Kenji played Kenji because some roles shouldn't be recast. A volunteer 737 taxied to Gate 5. A bottle of colored water dripped under the wing. A sign read, "Anomaly, assume unknown." Ops cloned the camera, stamped a receipt, and walked 1 copy to the library before the bell hit its 2nd ring. A teen spotter exported raw, generated a checksum, and handed 2 identical sticks to 2 unrelated aunties. The shrine received a 3rd copy with the priest's masking tape label, Truth, 2nd box. Firefighters rolled in, evaluated, stood down, boring on purpose. Practice took 13 minutes. We clapped with eyebrows. The airplane clapped by not making a sound. After tea, the PTA mom asked for the line we use when someone tries to be helpful by asking us to be quiet. The teacher handed her a printed card. "We share facts, not gossip." Please correct specifics. Otherwise, help us keep the link alive." The mom tucked it in her wallet next to a photo of a kid with a tooth gap. That evening, we brought the visitors to Gate 7. The orange and blue ribbons stirred like a duet. Lynn pressed a new ribbon in the mom's hand and said, "Tie this where your camera remembers for you." The mom cried without mess. Kenji looked away like a gentleman and then tightened the knot like a rampy. News drifted back from Nagoya. The service bulletin had become an airworthiness directive. Not headlines, homework with a due date. The manufacturer posted the PTA version of the drawings on their site. We printed 3 copies and laminated them because Okinawa knows humidity like a cousin. That week, our not-to-be-forgotten shelf gained one more label: exports. We slid in a USB marked Miyako and a second for Ishigaki, already promised. The librarian wrote a tiny note and taped it inside the binder's cover. "If this reaches you after a hard day, know we built it on one too. Use it, change it, send it back better." Walking home, I passed the seawall where the fisherman took the photo that kept the first day honest. He was there again, hands in pockets, weather in his face. "Do you still look at the wing?" he asked. I told him yes. Less from fear, more from habit-turned tool. He nodded like a man satisfied by the difference. I slept under a fan and a quiet sky. Sometime before morning, my brain filed a sentence I found waiting on my tongue. We didn't turn grief into content. We turned it into kit. When I woke, I wrote it on an index card and slid it behind my ID. The anniversary came with heat that hummed like electricity. We didn't plan a ceremony, we planned chores. Kenji checked the clone station at Gate 7, LED green. The librarian audited the drives. Checksums match. The teacher rang the bell twice for a new fact. All sister ships inspected, documented, dated. The retired mechanic brought a sack of mangoes and the pine model, because a town should never have to choose between fruit and physics. We gathered by the fence at noon. Lin, Kenji, Keita, the fisherman, the librarian, the teacher, the investigator who still had oil under one nail, the bar owner who learned to pronounce downstop as if it were a surname, and a dozen kids who can borescope a wooden wing faster than I can say checksum. We read the names of the crew and ground who did verbs that day. Leave, catch, hose, clone, call, count. We didn't clap. We stood. The airline sent a one-page letter with 4 nouns and a date: policy, inspection, retention, thanks. The board's final report settled into our shelf with the humility of paper that knows it will be read by grandchildren. No villains, many verbs, maintenance contributed, design improved, response effective, community evidence preserved. In the afternoon, a junior rampy stopped at the hall with a torque stripe photo from today. White, cracked where truth should crack when something moves. He logged it in our fleet completions book with a pen that refused to wobble. "Ugly but correct," he said, and the retired mechanic blessed him with a mango. On my last walk to Gate 7 before flying home, I pressed my forehead to the mesh like I had the first week. But this time the metal felt like infrastructure, not a boundary. The ribbons moved, not as memorial, but as bookmark. A ground agent nodded at the placard, auto-clone enabled, and winked. We have learned to hide our pride in procedures. Boarding, I chose my old seat, right side, aft of the wing. The leading edge wore cleanliness like resolve, not denial. APU whispered. Nothing dripped. I pressed my palm to the sidewall and felt only airplane, rivets, air, and the ordinary miracle of rightly boring systems. When we landed, Lynn stood by the door and said the softest sentence in her language: "Okeri, welcome back." Back home, I cleaned the sand from my shoes and taped a card above my desk, the one the island wrote together. If you saw it, save it. If you saved it, share it. If you shared it, shelf it. If you shelved it, teach it. If you taught it, sleep. If this story steadied your hands or gave your town a tool, subscribe to the story Beyond the Impact, hit like, and share with the neighbor who would keep the link alive long after the cameras leave.